Okay, let's make a start. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to King's College London. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute here at King's, and it's a real pleasure to welcome so many of you to this inaugural Fairfield lecture on devolution, growth and regional prosperity. So we're delighted to host this event in a partnership between the Policy Institute, the Strand Group at King's and Fairfield. So the government's devolution agenda promises to reshape Britain's economic landscape, but fundamental questions remain about its impact on regional inequality, public service delivery, local power structures. So tonight we're going to be exploring whether devolution can truly drive productivity and growth in our regions, what the white paper on structural reform means for local government, and how the financial models will affect public service delivery. So 3 or 4 small, straightforward topics for our discussion this evening. In that context, though, we're very fortunate to have on our panel tonight some genuine insight from leaders in their field who have both direct experience of delivery in this and what the latest research and analysis tells us. So first, we'll hear from Dr. Nick Johnson, who's the Mayor of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority. He'll share some of his reflections on the impact devolution could have on local communities and local authorities. Nick is passionate about public service. He's a paediatrician, consultant paediatrician, and co-chair of the Health Devolution Commission as well. We also have delighted to have Nora Senior, CBE, who's currently chair of the East Midlands Freeport and former chair of Webber Shandwick, UK and Ireland. So Nora brings extensive experience in regional economic development, having served as a chair of the Scottish Government's Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board and as president of the British Chambers of Commerce. And her current work in the East Midlands Freeport puts her at the forefront of actually implementing new models for regional growth and investment. Our panel also has Dan Turner, who is Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Sheffield, who's real cutting edge research on regional economies and devolution governance has helped shape our understanding of how policy interventions can address spatial inequalities. And then finally, we'll have Ed Balls, who's of course former Shadow Chancellor, and now we're delighted to say Professor of Political Economy at the Strand Group at King's. Ed, Dan's and his colleagues' recent research highlights that if we raise the performance of UK cities outside London to comparable European levels, it could yield a £55 billion annual growth dividend for the UK. And Ed's and his colleagues' research emphasises that the success of regional development in this context depends less on the specific policies and more on sustained cross-party commitment to reform, which is a theme I'm sure we're going to come back to. So it's going to be an incredibly rich discussion. It'll all be done by 7:45, so we can have more informal conversations afterwards. So let's crack on. It's a real pleasure first to invite Dr. Nick Johnson to come up for his initial remarks. After that, we'll get the whole panel up on stage for their views. Nick, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much to the Fairfield Policy Institute and King's College for having me here this evening and for inviting me to take part in this important and, like you say, timely conversation. Now, as you'd expect from an elected representative, I've done a fair bit of public speaking over the years, but this, I believe, is my first quote-unquote lecture, and I'm going to enjoy it. I should probably also re-emphasise there's been a recent change in my status, in as much as I won't be standing again for re-election this coming May, not because I'm against devolution, but for the purposes of tonight's event, it means I can perhaps afford to be a little bit more candid about my experience as a mayor. And before I do, at the risk of making people blush, I think it's also essential to say a huge thank and congratulations to Ed and Dan and their Harvard Kennedy School colleagues on what has clearly been an enormously influential work in laying the foundations for this government's generationally significant devolution agenda. It isn't something I'd fully appreciated at the time, but clearly in having a read and welcomed the white paper, and since then in preparing for today, immersing myself more fully in your findings, it's now obvious to me as a wholehearted believer in the devolution project that we are very much in your debt. So again, thank you. As for my experience, and how this affects my views on what next for devolution and regional growth. Genuinely, I have been impressed by the speed and scale of this government's ambitions for decentralising power within and across this country. In the run-up to last summer's general election, my fellow mayors and I were invited to a series of strategy sessions with the now Prime Minister, members of the then Shadow Cabinet and various principal advisors. As mayors and mayoral candidates alike, we were assured of how prominent and vital a role we would be playing in the design and delivery of a Labour government's plans for a national renewal. And as you might imagine, though it was pleasing to hear it said and reinforced, a political degree of healthy scepticism remained. So, on the almost immediate back of July the 4th success, whatever the collective noun for a group of mayors is, we received our summons to Downing Street as part of one of the PM's first order of business. The obligatory door of number 10 group selfies were taken, we were welcomed in for breakfast, and a cabinet table meeting in which the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister explained what they wanted from us in terms of local growth plans, partnership working, and the eventual proliferation of mayoral combined authorities, as well as setting out arrangements for both the Deputy Prime Minister's Mayoral Council and the Prime Minister's Councils of Nations and Regions. We then decamped south of the river to TfL's building, courtesy of Sadiq, for a UK Mayor's Roundtable with our respective Chief Execs, senior MHCLG officials, and as well the new Minister of State, Jim McMahon. And I can tell you, tails were wagging, heads were spinning, and not one of us could wait to get on with bringing it all to life. And we've each been at it since that time, in between a multitude of collective and respective ministerial meetings, making decent progress on our various binding constraints, sectoral strengths, and comparative advantages. And in lots of ways, it's been the most encouraging of experiences. That said, I don't think I'd be giving the game away in saying that not everything has been quite so plain sailing. For reasons of time and discretion, I'm not sure there's much point in going into causation, but with the exception of expressing and contextualising my own personal frustrations, and even then I'm trying not to dwell on too long. But almost all of what I've felt in terms of what might be considered negative stems from a point of understandable, but no less irrational impatience. I mean it. Being brutally honest with myself, a lot of what I feel comes from poor personal expectation management. But if polling is anything to go by, and judging by the national mood, I'm far from alone. As I say, it's an irrational as it's perfectly understandable. To have waited more than 14 years for a progressive government, to see your country undone by self-defeating public sector austerity, to be shamed and harmed by Brexit, to enjoy the sideshow of Boris and Liz. So when it finally looks like salvation is coming, it can't come soon enough. And when everything, everywhere, all at once, doesn't immediately improve, an entirely illogical disappointment sets in. So that's not to excuse the unforced errors, subjective and objective alike. Clearly, mistakes have been made, but that's inevitable, surely. For where I'm stood, modern day government looks like a near impossible feat of simultaneous micro and macro management, desperately under-resourced, woefully overburdened, always subject to the full and constant glare of a ravenous media cycle armed to the teeth with hindsight, retrospect, and a maddening disregard for complexity and nuance. So here we are, 8 months into an otherwise brand new government, one having a tough time trying to find its feet amongst the wreckage of a post-2010 era, working to set in motion a much needed and long overdue decade of national renewal. And for everything that's not quite yet as it might be, and I do want to stress the yet part of that sentence, for all that's not yet as it might be, there is at least cause for genuine hope and real positivity in the devolution agenda, direction of travel. That doesn't mean that there's no room for improvement, nor no need for subtle course correction. What brings me back to my new circumstances, giving me a little bit more leeway for a candor. Ed, Dan, I like what you say in your report about the crucial PM and Chancellor relationship. And it does seem very much like this has been embraced, at least as an ethos. But without substantial reforms to the actual machinery of central government, both in the efficacy of number 10 and the enormously powerful Treasury, I fear closer working on its own won't be enough to deliver the wider package of change. If I had to choose of the two, my very strong preference would be Her Majesty's Treasury, and with it, Green Book reform. In a nutshell, I want to see us far more focused on what something is worth and far less concerned about what it costs. Yes, there's a need for intelligent prudence in day-to-day expenditure, but so too is there an urgent necessity in investing in a better future, not least when the alternative, thanks to the performative parsimony of this government's predecessors, is every inch the present day's economic sclerosis. I know there's more to it, but the recently cancelled AstraZeneca expansion up in Liverpool is a prime example of where a Treasury orthodoxy, price of everything, approach to value for money, where it gets us. The same goes for my neck of the woods. You may not have heard of it, but we have a piece of nationally significant rail infrastructure at Ely Junction, in desperate need for public funding up to a tune of 500 million. I'm not saying that's not a lot of money, but the upgrades will enhance capacity, getting thousands of freight-carrying HGVs off the roads, opening up access to Felixstowe, the UK's largest container port, and increasing passenger service frequency, and all the positive externalities that flow as a result. And here's the thing. Green Book's BCR calculations say that every £1 invested in that scheme will see a return of £4.89. That's like saying we can't afford not to do it. And despite years of multi-agency and cross-party lobbying, we're still nowhere. And though really a matter for the Department of Transport, all involved say the decision is the Treasury's to make. Now, it could well be the case that we'll get the money in the summer once the spending review is completed. But the point is the decision could and should have been made years ago, and may well have been had the system been both more receptive to regional voices and geared to net positive value creation instead of zero-sum cost control. Let's get on with devolution. On productivity and growth, I'm not convinced GDP is the metric we should be using. I'd much prefer to see us talking about shared prosperity and quality of life. And yes, good jobs and meaningful careers are a huge part of these endeavours, but there are structural issues at play, and left unaddressed stand to erode any gains made in the building of a high-skill, high-wage economy. And housing is just one of them. In every conversation I've had with government on their welcome targets, I've stressed the issue of tenure and the need to ensure that modes of ownership are at the forefront of ministers' minds in pursuit of that 1.5 million new homes. It cannot be the case that first-time buyers continue to find themselves priced out by private and institutional investors looking to build their PRS portfolios when then let their properties to those they prevented from getting onto the housing ladder. It's economically detrimental for so many reasons, not least vital capital being diverted from productive investment in enterprise and innovation to literally rent extraction. And in the paying of these rents, lower participation in the local economy and near enough no capacity for personal savings. We are all poorer as a result. Similarly, on the point of needing more investment and geographic spread in the UK's innovation infrastructure, particularly with regard to R&D, I couldn't agree more. And clearly, with the case for Cambridge alive and well and the Oxfam Arc recently revived, government sees the importance of clusters and agglomeration. That said, even a university as long established and as well resourced as Cambridge needs help that only government can provide. A sensible approach to immigration for one thing, as at present global talent is being squandered. So too, a greater willingness to fund more postgraduate research. Not to oversimplify things, but PhDs can lead to patents and leading edge intellectual property. Is what high value economies are built on. After that, Cambridge doesn't do badly on the spinning out and initial scaling up of its best and brightest ideas, and government's planning reforms will go a long way to ensuring the various infrastructure is put in place to keep this particular golden goose in operation. But what I see is more being done at the national level to make the UK a place where such spin-outs and early scale-ups want to stay, where they can raise the capital they need to go on to the next level, and the next, and the next. To grow and to thrive, to create, contribute, to benefit from that self-sustaining intellectual economic ecosystem that at present seems to make the USA a more appealing long-term home for those enormously valuable UK-born endeavours. So yes, to supporting R&D, but let's be the place where the IPO happens too. On a related note, though we're making great progress, I'd like to see us go further and faster on drawing equivalence between a university degree and a technical college qualification. After all, what good is the prototype if it can't be put into production? And where's the value in architecture without a high-skilled construction industry? Equally, over the course of their lifetime, who couldn't someone do both? If we de-risk the opportunity to retrain, retool, reskill, doesn't our economy then become more resilient or more flexible or more fleet of foot? On the need for more investment in social infrastructure, I won't go into it here. Maybe we'll talk more in the conversation later. But as a huge fan of Marmot and as a children's doctor, you're definitely talking my language on the need for taking a public health approach to a future society. I give the example that about 12 years ago, public health professionals were in the NHS and there was a wrench for them to leave the NHS and to go into local government. It was definitely the right thing to do. I asked the question, if we were doing it now and those public health professionals were in the NHS, where would they go? Let's bring public health into the hands, into the purview of combined authorities and mayoralties. And then on models of decentralisation, right now, and what I think I want to see as much, a cultural shift as a hard and fast plan for reorganisation. I hope you can pick up, I love the idea of the devolution white paper, setting the floor and not the ceiling. I love the mantra of devolution by default. But in truth, really now, seeing is believing. As well as designing the modes by which powers and resources are transferred, we need to create a culture of genuine partnership between the various strands of government. If you'll forgive my crudity, we have to get away from that negative sense of the centre thinks it knows best versus yokels can't be trusted. We need to get away from hierarchy and move to an intelligent division of labour. Much of what needs to be done will be too complex and too nuanced to be entirely owned and managed at any one point of control. The devolution project is a vital and invaluable priority for this country. But rather than it just being some sort of great delineation, new redesignation of boundaries, my hope is that it also ushers in a new era of cooperative and collaborative maturity across and between this country's wealth of public sector departments, agencies and institutions. In closing, I do want to say that being mayor these past 4 years has been an absolute honour, and this last year or so in particular has been nothing short of exhilarating. I'm immensely proud of what we as an organisation have managed to accomplish, and I'm really grateful to my Chief Executive Rob Bridge and his team for their expertise and professionalism. Together, we've transformed what was, via the previous administration, a very badly broken mayoral combined authority. We've achieved trailblazer status as part of the Department of Work and Pensions Youth Guarantee Programme. We've forged a strategic placed partnership with Homes England, and we are the latest combined authority to make the mayoral decision on bus franchising. In so many ways, I really do wish that I was staying on, as there is still so much to do. If I could, and if the body was willing, but sadly it isn't. I'd be standing again, both because of how much I've loved doing the job and to be part of what feels like an unbelievably exciting and important period in British politics and governance. But regardless of where it might seem like we are right now, for the first time in a very long time, to my mind, we are definitely heading in the right direction. And every fibre of my being tells me that the devolution project will be central to the realisation of this country's best possible future. My head might not be spinning anymore, but my tail, you can't see it, is definitely still wagging. And I simply cannot wait to see it happen. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Nick. Brilliant introduction to this. So we're going to hear now from our panellists on their reflections, and then get into a bit of discussion, and then plenty of time for questions from you too. And actually, Dan, you're up first.
Great.
On my list. So really, just reflections on Nick's contribution on the agenda overall, and I think as well, given all your great work in this, that focus on inequality, your research showing that not much has moved in terms of inequality and productivity between regions outside of London and the South East. Is this devolution agenda going to help us shift that?
I should say that our work ends in 2019, and there's still an open question about what's happened to regional economic patterns since that point, but it seems like all of the indicators that things are still getting worse rather than better. One of the big facts that emerged from our paper was regional inequality, and this is big regions. These are East Midlands, West Midlands. It gets a little bit more complicated when you dig into lower levels of geography. Big region economic inequality in the UK is now comparable to regional economic inequality between East and West Germany or North and South Italy. And worse than that, we're heading in a continuing diverging trajectory, whereas Germany is converging, North and South Italy has remained broadly stable for a long time. And I think that, for me, one of the lessons from recent British policymaking, one of the lessons from our work that Ed and I and Anna Stansbury at MIT and other colleagues, Nyasha, Esme at UCL, have been doing is that the UK is really weird in at least two ways. So 2 ways in my niche world of regional policy. The first is we're the only large country that doesn't observe what are called agglomeration effects. So the idea that larger urban areas would see high levels of productivity because they have more effective labour markets, they have opportunities for serendipitous meetings between innovators or connections in supply chains. So we're the only country that doesn't observe that. And that's for a simple reason that the only places in the UK that observe larger scale driving higher levels of productivity are concentrated in the southeast of England. Even the Oxford-Cambridge corridor in Cambridge, is arguably undersized for the level of productivity that it has. So we don't see that dynamic that every other urban economy in the rest of Western Europe and North America seems to observe. The second way in which we're really weird is in the 1980s, as part of a worldwide trend towards, what some people nowadays would call neoliberalism, but kind of debundling a lot of the policies, economic structures of the post-war world, the UK was the only large country that, as well as privatizing firms, introducing markets, centralized the state. Everywhere else, there was a process of decentralization that matched that same logic of people at a local level nearer to the decision-making point know best, so trust them. And therefore, this isn't just in federal regimes. People often say, why can't we be more like Germany? But France, Italy, Sweden, Denmark were all decentralizing in the 1980s and 1990s. So we really stand out for being overly centralized, not having those economic dynamos. So I think that the question we're asking is what next for devolution and regional growth, and your question of are we doing enough on regional inequalities? And reflecting on what Nick said, I think, just briefly, first of all, devolution is a necessary part of the bundle. I don't think without devolution you can rebalance the regional economies of the UK, certainly the regional economies of England. Part of that is the Jonathan Powell thing of, well, you're in number 10, you pull a lever, you realize it's not connected to anything. You need organizations across the country who can say it's Ely Junction that's the problem, or in the East Midlands, this is the way that you would, here's a set of investable propositions that funders can come in and back. And you cannot drive that from Whitehall. So you need people on the ground with capability and with potential. But it's clearly not sufficient. And if it was sufficient, France would be far more regionally equal than it is now. So I think the best analogy for what the UK looks like is up to the early 1980s when François Mitterrand made his turn in 1982. France and the UK looked very similar constitutionally, economically, and still to this day, Paris dominates the French economy in the way that London and the Southeast dominates the British economy. But if you look at all of the other cities, second cities, regions outside of Paris, they have seen faster growth, they have stronger economies, and they've seen more convergence than the British economy outside of the Greater Southeast. So it's not going to solve everything, and clearly France has absolutely massive problems, and when you get into the geopolitics of it and the rise of the Yellow Vest movement and others and the Front National, this isn't a panacea, but it does work, the proof is there. To really supercharge it, what I think you need and what our first paper that we published on this topic shows is a tailored set of interventions that recognize there isn't one size fits all. You need to carefully identify what is the specific bottleneck that's holding back a given regional economy. Because Cambridge looks very different to Manchester, to Birmingham. In Cambridge, one of the things in our research was that clearly transport infrastructure holds you back. Clearly there are challenges around congestion on the rail network, the road network, and so on, before we even get into housing. So without large-scale capital investment in transport infrastructure, Cambridge cannot grow further, cannot raise its productivity. In somewhere like Manchester, that looks very different because it's more of a challenge around how do you get high value added, high productivity firms who are demanding high levels of skill to match with the fact that the skills system, and especially the university system in Manchester, is starting to really deliver lots of highly qualified people in Manchester who then can't get a job and end up underqualified and stuck there. So, maybe we can delve a little bit more about some of the economics of this in the Q&A, but just in my opening remarks, I wanted to reflect on the fact that the economics and the politics ultimately can't be separated, because the reason we have the regional inequality is, as you already mentioned, Bobby, and as Nick's referred to, is a continual process of chop and change and churn in our policy institutions, at least in this set of policies. The IFG did a piece of work a few years ago that said vocational policy, industrial policy, and regional policy were the three areas that had seen the highest rates of churn in policy since the late 1970s. So in a way, there's no puzzle as to why we've struggled so much to get regional economies firing. So how do you break that dynamo? And this is where, there are the economic arguments for devolution, that you need local knowledge. But the political argument for it is, when the Chancellor is standing up and saying, we don't have the money for capital budgets or capital investments that we would need to really move the dial on regional inequality in the UK, if you don't have people like Nick, if you don't have your peers as mayors able to go out, command media attention, mobilise parliamentary colleagues, whatever it might be, to say, no, you have to listen to the voice of the regions, you're going to keep getting that chop and change. And given that we know this is a generational challenge and will take commitment across multiple parliamentary cycles, we're never going to be able to fix the UK's regional problem till we fix the political problem. And I think devolution is a major step towards more balanced politics, because there are these power bases outside of the House of Commons.
Brilliant. That's amazing. What an excellent overview and summary of that connection. So Thank you so much, Dan. Really clear. So I'm going to turn to Nora next. And again, just your reflections on the devolution plan overall. And then obviously any reflections from a Freeport point of view and how that connects. And then I guess, given your background, your great expertise, business role and how that builds into this.
Thank you. I'll maybe just start by explaining perhaps what a Freeport is, because I'm sure you, not all of you will know what a Freeport is. So East Midlands, can everybody hear me? Sorry, is that better? Yeah. So East Midlands Freeport is a tri-link Freeport, which means that it goes across 3 different sites, each of about 200 hectares. There are 11 Freeports in the UK. Ours is the only one which is an inland Freeport. The rest are all based on the coast. So that makes us different. We're at the heart of the UK. We can be reached up to over 98% of the every part of the UK in under 4 hours by either road, rail or air. We have, we're in the heartland of manufacturing land with likes of Toyota, Rolls-Royce, big space industry based around us. We're also the home of where the MRI scanner was introduced. So we have a big life sciences body. The Freeport, the intention is to bring together mainly new inward investment, not for people to, like Amazon, to move up the road and take up space within these 3 large sites, but to attract foreign direct investment, so bringing new businesses into the area. And with the sites that we have, we should be able to attract over £4 billion of inward investment over the next 25 years, create 28,000 jobs, deliver £9 billion of GVA to the economy, and to have £1 billion of retained business rates. Those occupiers which come to base themselves on the Freeport will attract a number of incentives, like business rate relief, relief on national insurance, a number of customs, import and export tax relief that will help them to accelerate what they do and how they do business, creating jobs within the area that they are based in. So that's the kind of ethos or the background of what the Freeport is there to do, and where does that fit into the new mayoral authority? And there's a new East Midlands mayoral authority which is just being set up. It's not fully in full flight, I wouldn't say at the moment. It's in set-up mode, bringing various different groups together to populate the various positions that they need. But where do we see that there are benefits? So part of the big benefit will be around having a joined-up economic strategy for the East Midlands, which should deliver cohesion around what it is that we want to attract to our area. Now, we want to attract advanced manufacturing, we want to attract advanced logistics, clean energy, life sciences. But actually, one of the key ways that we need to unlock those 3 sites is by releasing the bottlenecks that happen around junction 23 to 25 on the M1. Because we're not going to get anything, we can attract all the business we like, but if we can't actually get people in and out of the site, then we're never going to get planning permission for it. So we have a wonderful public-private sector consortium who are looking at this conundrum, but the people that we actually need to galvanise are National Highways. They are centrally controlled, and they've told us that they are very supportive of what our aspiration and our vision is for attracting businesses to the East Midlands. But they have no levers within their toolbox to be able to help us, and they certainly don't have any money. So how are we going to overcome that? So we could have every great economic strategy in the world, but if we can't unlock those national bottlenecks and levers, then we're not going to be able to fulfil that regional dream. And it's the same for National Grid. So advanced manufacturing, we already have a number of very interested parties who are looking at us, looking at Germany, looking at Ireland. We have an issue in that advanced manufacturing needs an enormous amount of power. So when we speak to National Grid, they say, yes, you can have the power, but you can't have it before 2028. We only have until 2031 to offer all the incentives to the companies that are coming potentially to East Midlands Freeport. And if we can't deliver within that time, then the incentives and the power are already there and waiting in other areas such as Germany, Ireland, and even Poland. So again, that sits with National Grid. It's a national conundrum that we need to fix, and we need to be able to take the voice of the local authorities and the planning regimes that we've got and find out how we can move that further up the priority list. Now, if there are 13, as it will be, mayors, or 16 mayors as maybe, coming into the fray, then who's going to have the largest voice? When we had the Andy Streets in Birmingham, when, you know, your good self, there is a small cluster perhaps of 6 mayors. 6 against 16 is very different. So where will the voice come in terms of unlocking some of those key aspirations? That said, I think that the retained business rates, which the Freeport will be producing, will be reinvested into Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Leicestershire. And that is where the joined up economic benefit can really happen. Again, looking at inward investors, if they want to come and base themselves in the Freeport, they really want to know that the towns and cities where their people are going to be based are going to be worth living in, because a lot of these people will relocate some of their key executives and individuals. And if they come and they see a very poor town centre, as probably is the case in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, I hate to say it, with lack of investment and making those attractive places to live, then we're going to fail in our mission to be able to grow that attractive destination for people to come to. And that's where I see that mayoral authorities and devolved powers can really help. So removing bureaucracy, looking at attractive place investment, and ensuring that there is a joined up education and skills strategy to populate and answer the business skills needs. We have 6 world leading universities within the East Midlands. We have a number of colleges delivering excellent further in education qualifications. And always remembering that when we're thinking about hydrogen as one of our new clean energy aspirations, it's actually going to be plumbers, electricians, that are going to be upskilled and reskilled. It's not going to be graduates that are going to be coming out. There will be a number of graduates that will look at one end of it, but actually in terms of delivery, we need to upskill our existing plumbers, electricians and engineers in order to deliver the practicalities of what we will do within a hydrogen environment. And that means that we need a coordinated and cohesive skills and innovation programme, which will run through our whole regional education system. And again, that's where I think it's really important that we have a local decision making looking at local priorities. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much. That was excellent as well. Thank you, Nora. And just interesting, the connections between Dan's point about needing that local and regional perspective to identify those bottlenecks, but then in many cases those bottlenecks are caused nationally, and then it needs the power to be able to engage nationally as well. So it's a very interconnected point. So finally, to Ed, my question for you is a very general one. What needs to happen to make devolution, regional devolution, a success? You get the big question.
That is the question. That's what we need to answer. And thank you, Bobby. Thank you to Fairfield for supporting this this event to ask that question. Thank you to Nick for his public service. I have to say, you're standing down as mayor. Your work is not yet done. I'll explain why in a second. But listening to Nick and listening to Nora, I mean, just a starting point, I'm struck by already how much this debate has changed. over the last 25 years. I grew up in Nottingham, but lived for 30 years in Wakefield. When we went to government in 1997, I remember very early on a meeting in Wakefield in the town hall, talking about kind of regional policy. And, you know, back at that point and in the previous decades, regional policy was always seen as in a sort of compensatory way. You know, how do we help people through their hardship? And we had this conversation in Wakefield where, you know, the leader of the council, I think it was, or his deputy said, it is so unfair the way we're treated in Wakefield. We have Objective 2 funding from the European Union. And in Sheffield, they have Objective 1 and they get more money. And I said, but the reason for that is because in Sheffield, they have higher unemployment and lower incomes. And he said, I know, but if only we could persuade people we were doing as badly as them, we would get more money and that would be fairer. And I remember at the time thinking that, you know, if that is the way in which thinking about regional policy in previous decades has got us to, that is not the solution. And the solution is what you were talking about, which is actually about strategies around skills and innovation and bringing in firms to succeed, building upon your strengths. And it actually is a very big transformation in the way in which local government, sub-regional government mayors talk about economics. But that's how we now, I mean, it's a big change from previous decades of regional policy. In the work we've done, Bobby, which was supported by you here and King's, also Harvard, 3 different elements in it, which is how we've thought about going about research. First of all, kind of using the best data and the best economics. Dan's talked about that, which we did with Anna, which basically says, if you look at the history of inequality, regional and spatial inequality in Britain, if only our cities and city regions did as well relative to our capital as they do in France and Germany and America, we would be tens of billions of pounds richer, there'd be more tax revenues, we'd be doing much better. That gap is such a drag on our performance, and the reality is, we say economically, that our city regions are too small, the transport infrastructure is too small, the housing needs aren't met, the skill gaps are real. It's not actually graduates, but it's high STEM graduates or it's non-graduate skills. The pattern of innovation spending in our country compared to other countries, compared to the private sector, is still very southern skewed. And that all holds back our ability to drive higher growth and productivity in the non-London regions. 30 years ago, we would have been talking about unemployment. But actually today, it's about the quality of jobs and wages and productivity and employment. And that's what Paper One does. But the second thing which we did, because this is how I kind of like to think about this kind of work, that there's only so far data and economics can take you, and you've also got to draw upon lived experience. And we did a 100-hour-long transcribed and fully public interviews with pretty much all the prime ministers, chancellors, local government ministers, business secretaries, a lot of local government leaders in that entire period from the 80s through to now. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, George Osborne, John Major, loads of names you would know, because there's stuff you can get from those conversations qualitatively, which you don't see in the data, but help you understand the answer to your question. And they all say, it's so fascinating to read how consistent they are, that if only we had started earlier with more determination, we were too late to this. Often they say, you know, we came in and we ripped up what we inherited, you know, abolishing the regional development agencies in 2010, some of the stuff which, which we did as well. And that actually, that chop and change is so destabilizing that if you simply try and pull levers from the centre, you just make second best choices. But of course, it's also about quantum of resources. And backing leadership and local decision making at the right level, properly empowered, matched by resources, is what we should have done. And they also all say, by the way, and unless you have a consensus that this is what we're going to do, which we stick to for 10, 20 years, rather than 3 or 5 years, it's never going to make a difference, because everybody's always running to catch up with the new regime. And they all regret that that's what they did. And, you know, Michael Heseltine's got particular regrets about what happened in 1973, and John Major's got particular regrets about what he did with Michael Heseltine in 1992. If only I'd backed him more. Tony Blair thinks he was the great devolver. And I said, but we didn't really get to that, Tony, for 10 years. He said, really? I thought I was in favour of mayors. Well, not for quite a long time. And George Osborne did some really good stuff, but actually he did not fight hard enough to get his cabinet colleagues into line, and David Cameron didn't take enough interest. And so the third thing which we then do, in our third paper, is say, because this is what we wanted to do, if you really want to learn from the economics, but also the history, how do you do things differently? What are the things that you should do from the start? Because I think that we are best doing this kind of research if it's very tangible and measurable. I think, Nick, I mean, the reason why your work is not done is because John Major didn't do the interview with us when he was Prime Minister. He was a former Prime Minister. And Gordon Brown was a former Chancellor and former Prime Minister. And they are still influencing the debate. And sometimes it's a bit of a pain if you are a politician, a cabinet minister, and the former guys pop up and start doing interviews and making speeches and going on the Koonsberg show. But it's good because we want to hear. So we want to hear from you more. You are right to say the jury's out, but what will you think in 1 year and 2 years' time? That is when it will really start to be important, your contribution. So your work is not yet done. Consistent with your health and with the agreement of your spouse, you must continue to contribute. But, so some positive things first. It was great to see all the mayors with the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister in Downing Street in the early days saying, we're going to do this. John Major, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, David Cameron, George Osborne did not do that for years. That is really good. By the way, I think Rachel Reeves should have been there. Come back to that. Secondly, the white paper from the Angela Rayner's department was really good in saying we're going to make sure this is for everywhere in the country, not just some places. It doesn't mean that you can't focus your resources and your effort where you can get the quickest wins. Of course we should focus on our big city regions. But if you say to people in Cambridge, it won't be Cambridge, in Blackburn or Burnley or Wakefield, sorry, you're in kind of the second phase, that isn't going to work. Because I don't think it's possible for this to be, it has to be the potential for all. And that is really good. And she's made Angela Rayner, some very big, difficult decisions, which I personally think are right, about local government reform as part of that. I thought what Rachel Reeves said about the Cambridge-Oxford corridor and the importance of kind of local growth driving her national growth objective, all really good. But you're right, there's still some questions. Because what we know is when you're under pressure for growth in the economy and you want it to happen quickly, the Whitehall default is to say, you know, it's quite complicated, all this devolution. And have they really got the capacity? And can we really trust this guy in Cambridge? And why don't we just get on and do it ourselves? That is like risk one. Because every former big politician, policymaker we spoke to, knew they did that and regretted it. The second thing is the individual department which says, well, you know, I know they want this, and that's sort of the local government department's responsibility, but, you know, I'm not sure our stakeholders will go along with this, you know. If you look at our paper, consistently across Labour and Conservative governments, and the inability to get post-16 or post-18 skills thought about in a proper way in localities, as opposed to at the centre. I remember going to see the Advantage West Midlands board in the late first, you know, the first decade of the 2000s, and saying, but, you know, the Learning and Skills Council, they're based in Coventry, and we're meeting in Birmingham. That's quite close. And they said they could be in Timbuktu, as far as we're concerned, because they in no way engage with what we're trying to lead with businesses in our region. And so, second question, are we actually really gripping this agenda in all the departments where we need it to? And the thing which then kind of relates to that is the centre, because you are right to talk about the Treasury in number 10. It's really important what happens in business and trade and in skills and work and pensions. But we know that if number 10 and the Treasury don't think that this is important and we're going to make changes now for the long term, if either of them decides, is it really the priority? Or isn't that department right that if we pull levers from the centre, we'll get more quick results? The moment you have that focus from the centre diminishing, honestly, it all goes backwards. And I think one of the biggest learning I have from our work is that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair were never united. And David Cameron and George Osborne were never united. And John Major and Michael Heseltine and Ken Clarke were never united in saying, we're going to do this, and that is what our cabinet is going to do. And so that's my third question. Are we willing to take the time? Are we going to challenge the recalcitrants who would rather not do it? And is the centre really determined? And I don't know the answer to those questions yet either, but I think all the lessons of history are that unless you kind of get that sense of common purpose and stick to it. And the great thing is that we haven't had a government which has come in and ripped up the infrastructure. They didn't say, we don't like mayors or combined authorities. They're sort of trying to say, actually, maybe it was our idea in the first place. That's the nature of politics. That's okay. The important thing is that you take what you've got and you build upon it and you keep driving it forward. And so that is, I think, the answer to your question, Bobby. I don't know yet whether this government is going to deliver. We have given them our best advice. All the evidence from the last 40 years is that we really know what not to do. And they've done a bunch of stuff and not rip stuff up, which is really positive. But are they going to stay the course? And is this spending review going to match consistent devolution, which is risky, and resources and the things which will matter around innovation, skills and local transport? I don't know. But those are the metrics. And so the reason why you're going to have to come back in a year's time is you have to tell us. If John Major can do it and Tony Blair can do it, so can you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Ed. So we're going to come to questions, but I did want to just say, Nick, if there was any reflection on anything you've heard from this, I just want to feedback. And if you can start thinking of your questions and get your hands up, we will come to you in a sec.
I think it's certainly very interesting to hear about the Freeport. I obviously know about Claire and what she's doing in the East Midlands, and I think there are some examples where Freeports as an idea that's out there is going to be well used within the devolution agenda. I think you presented that very well, this kind of potential link with combined authorities. I don't think they would happen as well without a combined authority. And in regards to yourself, Ed, it feels like you've been in the room, or you've certainly maybe been speaking to some old friends, because the point that you make, particularly about post-16 education, there was a lot of kind of angst from within the mayoral team, is that, trust us. Let's, but it wasn't the breakdown from the Department of Education. There was a bit of a buy-in from the Department of Work and Pensions. I think there is room for real positives around transport, and that's partly born of a love of buses that all mayors seem to have, trailblazed a little bit by Andy Burnham, of course, and the success in 3 tranches to do the franchising. Certainly something that, as a success for my own 4 years, the fact that on the very day that I decided I would stand down was the day I actually then pushed the button on a transformational change for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And that example being particular because a lot of people said at the start, you can't do it. It's a rural area. But actually, by a set of circumstances where we demonstrated a willingness to go a little bit further. There's a lot about fiscal challenges, because one of the things that I've done in Cambridge and Peterborough is I've introduced a mayoral precept. Not all mayors have done, but it was something that was seen as a political time bomb. It's not a good thing to ask people locally for more tax, but actually the population was won over, because when they were asked to you know, to have a little bit more, literally 2-3% more on their council tax bills, because it was very specifically targeted and it was seen as this is a local solution to challenge the falling standards of public transport in our local area. And because we had the mayoral powers, it seemed to give a lever, and it seemed to give a sense of this is how we can transform. So in transport, I think we are working, Department of Transport, Lou Hay before now, Heidi Alexander, it's a job being well done. I think there is room to be positive about skills to a point, but disappointment about the lack of belief, or indeed a very important word in medicine there, sorry, in politics, trust. And that's something, you know, if what we've really got to work on is that development of a trust from literally number 10, central government, that they believe that the people who are being tasked with delivering the growth, the Andy Burnhams, the Steve Rotherhams, Kim up in the northeast, that we really, really trust the local politicians, and generally a belief again in local government. I do think we've got Angie Rayner has got our back, and when I was with her when she announced the sort of white paper just before Christmas, I thought, you did good, you know, we were pleased. But like you, I have a sense of maybe I won't be around to see how it plays out with the spending review. I still cross my fingers, and I still believe, and I think with some very powerful advocates. And to be fair, Andy Street, before Richard take over from him, was a perfect example. He seemed to help the narrative for devolution on the blue team as much as on the red team. And for good or bad, whatever, with what Ben's been doing up in Teesside, there's a narrative there that people believe in something's happening in Teesside, an area I know very well. So don't give up.
Yep.
Don't give up.
Really good. Bill, fingers crossed. So I think we had the microphone there. Yes. If you just, we'll take 2 or 3. We've only got 10 minutes for this. So nice, short, succinct questions. And we'll take 2 or 3 at a time. Thank you.
Brilliant. So, hi, my name's Jonathan. I run a homelessness charity that does cash transfers to people experiencing homelessness in the UK. We've given out over £1.7 million so far. And what we know from what we do is the ROI to government is about 20x. And for people who are not familiar with homelessness spending, much of this comes from temporary accommodation spend, right? We're spending about 90 million a month on temporary accommodation. With our philanthropic matching, there's over 40x ROI. Even if you're heavily cynical about attribution, you can discount that quite heavily and still have quite a good return. But it's very, very difficult to get local authorities to act on this because they have such tight budgets. So my question is, you know, when we say we can't make decisions, we can't make obvious decisions, what powers do we need to give local authorities so that they can actually make these decisions?
Very good. Very good. Thank you. I saw this lady on the edge. Thank you.
From the Centre for Sustainable Business here at King's. Really marvellous, thank you. I'm very interested in what can be done within regions to ensure that capabilities, capacity, the inclusion of all the different voices, particularly marginalised and small businesses, not just the major players, so that you can really take everyone with you when seeking to deliver regional growth and the opportunity is really maximised.
Yeah. There's a mic at the back, I think. If you want to come, I did this guy here has been up from the beginning.
Thank you. I was SIPFA accountant at Cambridge City and Cambridge County in the 70s. It's unfortunate you didn't research back then. In the 70s, the council set the rate to cover their revenue. There was fundamentally no central government funding. Borrowing was capped, but it was all at the discretion. The spending was all at the discretion of the local council. The only involvement we had with central government was the district auditor to make sure that we weren't running off with the money. Isn't that devolution, and isn't partnering with the central governments a fraud of devolution?
Goodness. That's good. Great. So let's take those 3. and we'll just go down the panel. And
I'm happy to
pick
start.
which one.
Sorry, what was your name? Peter. We did speak to some people who went back that far. So Michael Heseltine opens with himself on like a light airplane flying up and down England, drawing lines on a map to decide the last version of local government reorganisation. But we heard this point from a lot of people that without the real fiscal powers, you don't have, to be as kind of banal about it in local government finances, you can't say this is a good opportunity and therefore on my own initiative, I'm going to go to a bond market and back this and take the risk and then justify myself and defend myself to my voters in a way that is entirely autonomous of whatever someone marking your homework in the Treasury might think. So it's a crucial mechanism to drive genuine accountability, risk-taking, and align all the incentives at a local level. So I totally agree with you. And the OECD shows that, Andres Rodrigo Pose just down the road at LSE published a paper a few years ago showing if you decentralize spending and mandates for spending without decentralizing those tax powers, not only do you not get more growth, it actually reduces the rate of growth because people just get really confused about mandates, accountability, and so on. You really need to tie those things together. Now, when we spoke to George Osborne in our project, he said he didn't want the first thing they asked mayors to do, and Nick is a brave exception to the rule on this, to raise a tax as soon as they get established, because he wanted them to be established as legitimate political authorities first, and then eventually people would be more happy when they chose to raise a tax. The fact that very few places have, the fact that Andy Burnham, who I think would be the obvious example, has not yet raised any local taxes, maybe puts a question mark around that model. Maybe it needs to be central government that says, we're now going to push taxes down to you, whether you like it or not. I don't know, but I think it has to happen ultimately as part of a sustainable mix. And then just quickly on Jonathan's point around cash transfers. So let me answer that obliquely, which is to say that I think maybe a theme from part of this conversation is leadership really matters. And it is so easy consistently within these complicated, messy systems where all the mandates are confused to say, well, I'd love to, but actually this person's stopping me, or if I only had the money, or it's going to be really hard relative to these other priorities. But we know just from this policy area that when, in some negative examples, so like when David Blunkett said, no, skills is not going to be part of the RDA's budget, then here we are 25 years on talking about this path dependency of why can't we crack skills in regional policy? But then you have really positive examples. So again, for us, the fact that George Osborne was a Northern MP and said, we need to back what's happening in Manchester because that's where our growth is going to come from. And he was able to drive that despite, admittedly, he was Chancellor, so he had the power, but he could drive that despite the fact that there was no cabinet support and in some cases cabinet opposition, shows that if it's prioritised, it can be done and you can wade through bureaucracy. Now, there are some caveats around like, that's not always true in local government, their hands are tied. But at a national level, at least, it's that leadership that really counts.
Thanks very much.
But there are substantial problems with the model you described, and substantial problems in Britain in 2025, even compared to the mid-1970s, because our country is unequal and has become spatially more unequal, as Dan said, so that the gap is greater between London, the South East, and the rest of the UK regions, and between East and West Germany or North and South Italy. And on your model, it would probably be okay in Cambridge, and it would certainly be fine in Oxford. But if you say local government resources, the amount they can raise will determine how much they spend with a small borrowing power, and that's it. You are entrenching enormous inequality in the provision of public services between rich parts of the country, where people can pay with the same tax rate a lot more tax, and poor parts of the country. And the reality is, in our system, we have a lot of equalisation which happens in the way in which we both distribute business rates and also, much more importantly, in the way in which we distribute public spending. And to say that good devolution, pure devolution, is where local authorities spend what they raise in tax, is to say, and I'm willing to pay a very substantial price in terms of inequality and outcomes to get that pure devolution. And I'm not sure that I would sign up to that. And successive governments haven't done for that reason. And part of the reason why we haven't seen a big devolution in taxation is also for that same reason. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't move in that direction some around taxation. But I don't think that, that would be fair. And then I think back to my time, and this is also a big devolution development, being Secretary of State for Children's Schools and Families, so sort of responsible for locally financed children's service delivery around the country. And you stand up in Parliament and you answer questions from MPs. And it might be really good in Bristol, what the Bristol Local Authority is doing for children's services, or for children with special educational needs, or for children in care. But if you're talking to the MP for Hull, telling them it's good in Bristol doesn't really help, because they want to know what about in Hull? And if Hull is doing badly because they are incompetent, are we going to act? And that's what the inspection regime is about. But what happens if they're just doing worse in Hull because there's less money coming in because incomes are lower? Do we shrug our shoulders? I'm not sure I'm going to shrug my shoulders on that. And so that is a necessary constraint in a small country with wide inequality across areas. You have to think about that.
Did you, in your own speech, say that one county was complaining that they were rewarding bad behaviour and punishing good behaviour?
Sure.
And we've done that for 50 years.
Sure.
And the result is what
Sure.
you expect if you reward bad behaviour and punish good behaviour.
Yeah, well, so that takes you to a hard end on moral choices, and it's absolutely true that if you listen to some Conservative politicians, they would say scrap the Barnett formula and let Scotland and Wales kind of go their own way, and they'll either have to have worse public services, or they'll have to have higher taxes, and you have to think to yourself: is that consistent with the cohesion of a country? The United Kingdom. And the choice we've made as a society is to say, no, it's not, which is why we have some equalisation in our public spending, and actually across areas in England, much more. So all I'm saying, so the thing I would say to you is I want councils to be accountable for what they do, and I think they should have more powers to raise some money. But to taking it to your example, which is councils should only spend what they raise, you have to be willing to put up with a lot of inequality, and maybe you are. That's okay, but I'm not sure I am.
Let's draw. This sounds like the conversation for a drink, over a drink, which we're very, very close to.
It's an interesting point because it's easy to be starry-eyed about devolution, but it has some difficult consequences.
Yep. So this. Want to respond to the business? Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So if we can just hear from Nora and Nick, and then you are so close to getting a drink, everyone. We will go straight to that. And just to reassure all those people with their hands up, the panel is staying around so we can have these conversations and you can pick them up there. But please, Nora and then Nick.
A very short response to Laura's question on inclusion of particularly SMEs. I have been very encouraged with our mayoral authority and the way that it's brought a business advisory board together comprising, big business, small business, a range of social enterprises, because there is the connectivity of how they all work together in partnership. And that is really feeding into the whole economic strategy for the region. So I'm actually very hopeful that the mayoral authorities will be able to have a much more cohesive and listened to responsive economic strategy than which is relevant for the region rather than what, as to Ed's point, sometimes comes out of central government.
And to follow that on, I think one of the things that hasn't maybe been made clear is that as different combined authorities have come up over the different as they've all been put through Acts of Parliament, they've actually all been constituted with different powers at different stages. You'll know that some areas have police and crime commissioners' responsibility. That's not the case in Cambridgeshire. But one of the unique things, I believe, in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough was that because we had a big, significant problem, you may recall this, Mr. Daw, about the LEP, It was essentially fell in on itself for various reasons, as it corresponded to a time that the combined authority was being put together. And we've actually got a voting member of the business community on our board. And I would argue that makes us in a very good position to get the voice of business, large and small, working alongside elected representatives from the constituent authorities. Again, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough is rather unique because currently we actually have all the district councils have a seat at the board, whereas that's not something that's replicated elsewhere around. So I would argue that there's a whole argument as new combined authorities are put together, a business board LEP equivalent should be a voting member. But actually, one thing I've never achieved is that on the same board, we also have a representation, the chair of the Integrated Care Board. I said as you optimistically, as a medic coming into the political world, I wanted the Integrated Care Board member to have a vote on the board of the combined authority. So I think there is examples where that could happen, not just to benefit business, but also other public bodies that could be part of the combined authority board. And to go back to the point about homelessness, there is a story, and I have, I know that Ed will know him very well, Andy Burnham, and I've got to know him over the course of time. To some extent, he's mentored me. But there is a story that when he got first elected in Manchester, he said he campaigned, said, I'm going to deal with homelessness in Greater Manchester. To which when he first arrived, says, you've got no responsibility. You've got no statutory responsibility to deal with homelessness. But there's this thing about combined authorities, which I think you could ask, be it in the northeast with Kim or in the west with Dan, is that you are a convener. And I would argue, say, in my area, one of the important things that we've been able to convene about is a narrative which is very important about water resource management. If any of you know Cambridgeshire very well, it's very famous for its fens, its unique landscape, but it has these bizarre challenges that we have a situation that we're at serious risk of damaging our unique chalk streams by over-abstraction, but at the same time being a lot of the time below sea level, we're at constant threat of being flooded. So you can, you try and get that, the Fenland District Council to deal with that problem as a whole. We need kind of devolved strategic organisations coming together and convening, because at the same time as dealing with water management and how we're going to provide water to all these new homes, we've also got to be talking about flood management, which would be just as relevant in East Midlands and many other areas around the country. So I know that I've used your question as an opportunity to talk about the power of convening, but I would, and I'm sure he would speak more eloquently about it. In the very area that you're challenged by, the homelessness thing, is that you look at the examples that have been achieved in Greater Manchester, and Andy Burnham would speak very eloquently about that, as to how maybe you can move forward again. But I would say this, wouldn't I, through the badge of devolution and with a convening combined authority.
Brilliant. What a great place to end. And many apologies to all those hands that went up. It is a great sign of a very engaged audience and conversation. And like I say, we are going to have space and time afterwards to continue that more informally. Finally, from me, just before, I'm going to invite Martin Tucker in a minute, the Managing Director at Fairfield, just to say a few words. And just for me to do quick final thanks from our perspective, just to the teams at the Policy Institute, at the Strand Group, and at Fairfield for organising all of tonight. It was great to work with you, and particularly Roger. To all of you for coming, really expert and great engagement and questions. And of course, finally, to our excellent panel for sharing their expertise tonight. And thank you, Nick, in particular.
Thank you, Bobby, and good evening, and thanks everybody for attending the inaugural Fairfield lecture. And I too would like to extend my thanks to the panel, to Nick, to Nora, to Ed, and to Dan, and thank you, Bobby, and to Bobby's team as well, who are all out there and having organised a brilliant event. I wrote down a couple of fragments of sentences from what I just heard, which resonated with me and what we do as a business. Leadership really matters was the first thing I wrote, and part of the success of this whole endeavour will depend on backing leadership at a local level with appropriate resources, and I think that's something that we feel very strongly about. This celebrates our 5th year as a business, and I'd be delighted if all of you were able to come and join us for a drink, which is just through those doors on the other side of the foyer. Thank you very much.